Neurodivergence just means, a friend of mine calls it a different operating system. He's very much a computer guy. And if you look at the majority of people in the world, if you look at the majority of people in a classroom or an office, most of them are going to be what we call neurotypical. The people who are outside of that on either shoulder of the bell curve are your neurodivergent folks. So some are born with neurodivergency, they're born with autism, or they're born autistic, rather, that's the more correct term. They're born autistic, they're born with a learning disability. They may have a brain injury, either, like fetal alcohol or an acquired brain injury later. They can have, post-traumatic stress, anything that makes someone's brain respond to the world differently. Anyone who sees the world differently typically falls into that neurodivergent category. It's not a big population, but as many emergency planners will know, it tends to be a vulnerable population. And a big reason for that is that folks who are neurodivergent are not often invited to that emergency planning table, that crisis management table, to say, this is what works for us. This is supports that would help us. And it's becoming a more vocal community. A lot of children who have been diagnosed are now adults. There's a lot of adults now who are looking back after their child goes through their diagnostic process going, I am as well. And finding out that their whole life now makes a different kind of sense because it's how their brain is wired. It's how their brain processes the world around them. And very much autism and neurodivergencies, and autism I use as a reference point because a lot of people have heard about autism. They know an autistic individual. You probably know someone who has had a brain injury, a learning disability, someone who has cognitive challenges. That's neurodivergence. And you know that they're experiencing the world differently. It can be sensory, it can be processing, but we need to understand that not everyone is going to see the world like that neurotypical middle, and they can't force themselves to. That's called masking, and it's actually quite harmful to neurodivergent folks to have to try and pretend to be something that they're not long term. The main thing they need to consider is including those community members in their planning, having them be participants of that planning, participants in the response, and not just recipients. These are people who have ideas and thoughts and things that work for them and want to be involved. The more you have the people that you're supporting involved in your planning, the more successful the planning is going to be, because you're going to get their unique insights. You're going to get their understanding of, yes, this may work for you in a neurotypical way, but for neurodivergent folks, that seems like the most horrible thing ever. Like that just has so many things that could be overwhelming or don't make sense to someone who's neurodivergent, rather than telling them, well, you got to figure it out and do it the way we do it for everyone else. We need to try and be inclusive and say, how can we make this work for you? Here's the parameters that we can work within. What accommodations will help support you so that this can be successful for you as well as your neighbors or your other community members? Bringing people into the conversation and having them be a part of that is huge. It is such a simple step to success. It's just opening the door and saying, let's look at it from a different perspective. Probably the biggest thing for emergency managers and emergency planners to understand is that someone who's neurodivergent is going to see the world differently than you do. They may not recognize intuitively that something is a hazard. They may not intuitively be able to push through a sensory overload. They may need extra time for processing. They may have had bad experiences and not have a level of trust that they're going to just willingly go along and not ask questions. Or they may ask a lot of questions because they need information in order to make a decision. The best thing that emergency planners can do is engage with their local community members, have open houses. Here in Canada, we have sensory-friendly open houses at fire departments and during different events where it gives our neurodivergent community members a way to connect with the response community in a low stress environment and see beyond their uniform. And those response community members can see all of their neighbors and friends outside of a response. When I went into a situation as a fire captain, I was seeing my friends and neighbors very differently because I was wearing my professional, we're in a response mode, hat. When I saw them at a community event or we ran into each other at the grocery store, it's a very different dynamic. Having your community members be a part of that lets them see beyond the uniform, and also to understand what you're doing is to help keep them safe, to reduce harm and get everything back to normal, and let them be a part of that process. Invite them in and make them a part of those conversations, just like you would have with your disability community or communities that have language barriers or cultural challenges that may make it hard for them to be a part of the middle of the bell curve neurotypical response. Think of it as not someone that you are not going to be able to work with, but someone who may need an extra bit of support to get safely where they need to be for it to be successful. I would say one of the questions I almost get asked is, well, how do we find our neurodivergent community members? Use social media, have a sensory friendly open house, invite your schools when you're doing a fire drill day to have a sensory friendly event. Talk to community groups, have an open house and say, we want to learn about how we can better serve you. And also listen on social media, Twitter, Instagram, listen to what those community members are saying. There's a lot of really great neurodivergent leaders on LinkedIn in professional areas, and they want to learn. So connect with them and reciprocate back as leaders and say, we want to hear you. We want to do better. Let's have a conversation and just get those conversations started.